Sorry. The great caves of India, Ajanta, Bandhavgarh, Ellora and Aurangabad, with Pia Brancaccio Nayanjot Lahiri, Anirudh Kanisetti in conversation with William Dalrymple. The great cave complexes of India from Ajanta and Ellora to Bandhavgarh and Aurangabad contain some of the greatest masterpieces of early Indian art. Pia, professor in the Department of Art and Art History at Drexel University. Professor Nayanjot Lahiri, a historian and archaeologist of ancient India. Anirudh Kanisetti, an award-winning author, are in conversation with historian and art historian William Dalrymple. They discuss the significance of these caves and the milieu they represent. I will invite our panel on stage. Please welcome Pia Brancaccio, Professor of Art History at Drexel University in Philadelphia, whose research focuses on early Buddhist art in Southeast Asia and cross-cultural exchange. She has published on the Buddhist caves at Aurangabad, cave temples in Maharashtra, and Gandharan art. Nayanjot Lahiri is a professor of history at Ashoka University. She has written scholarly monograph on ancient India and general books that have gained her a large following. Her acclaimed biography, Ashoka in Ancient India, fetched her John F. Richards Prize in South Asian History. Her book on the afterlife of Ashoka has just been published as Searching for Ashoka, Questing for a Buddhist King from India to Thailand. Anirudh Kanisetti is the award-winning author of Lords of Deccan, a new history of medieval South India. Kanisetti is the recipient of grants from Princeton Center for Digital Humanities and the India Foundation for the Arts. William Dalrymple is the author of many prize-winning books like White Mughals, The Last Mughal, The Return of King, The Anarchy. Dalrymple has been awarded 5 honorary doctorates, is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, the Royal Asiatic Society, and the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and he has held visiting lectureship at Princeton, Brown, and Oxford. He is also the founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literature Festival. So over to our very worthy panelists.
Well, never let it be said that people aren't interested in history and art history. Look at this extraordinary crowd. Even if we have Gulzar to thank for some of it, or maybe even most of it. Well, every other time I do a session at this festival, I must make sure that Gulzar or Javed Saab are in immediately before we start talking to fill out the hall. One of the most extraordinary classes of monuments in this extraordinary country are the great caves of the early centuries BCE and CE, which cover the length and breadth of the country. And today we're just going to take a little run through some of the most extraordinary examples, by no means complete, and reflecting the particular interests of all our different panelists. I will say a brief word about the newly rediscovered and cleaned images from caves 9 and 10 at Ajanta. Pia will take up the baton at that point and carry on about a little bit about Ajanta and maybe also something on Aurangabad, or about which she's written the most extraordinary monograph. Highly recommend anyone that wants to take this on. Pia's book, which calls itself about the caves about Aurangabad, is in fact a book which deals with the whole phenomenon of Buddhist cave excavation and art and sculpture and it was certainly the book which I went to and learnt most from. So it's a huge privilege to have her here all the way from the States to join this panel. And I can't recommend her work more. And our own Nayanjot Lahiri of Ashoka University, who's been here many times and is an old friend of the festival and is one of the most distinguished ancient historians in the country. She will be unveiling an extraordinary new site discovered this year in plain sight in Bandhavgarh, in the tiger reserves, which interestingly does not seem to be a religious monument, but we can hear more about that in a bit from her, rather than me mangling it. Finally, the new star, the winner of this year's Tata Non-Fiction Book of the Year Award, Anirudh Kanisetti, whose Lords of the Deccan is the kind of thing, yes, a big round of applause for Anirudh. Age 26, winning the Tata Book of the Year Award is an extraordinary achievement. And it does what is so rare anywhere, but perhaps especially in this country, bring cutting-edge research in archaeology, history, art history, and ancient history to a wide audience in a deeply scholarly but entirely accessible manner that makes history live again and resurrects these extraordinary kings of dynasties such as the Rashtrakutas and the Chalukyas, who are figures that we all have read about in textbooks or on ASI red stone plaques at the opening of sites, but who do not come to mind with sort of images in the way that, say, the Mughals or the Marathas do. These figures remain tragically faceless and lifeless, and Anirudh's book is a triumph of how you can, without losing scholarly objectivity and precision, resurrect from the dead these extraordinary dynasties which have received far too little attention. But he particularly will be talking about the excavation of Ellora, which I'm sure many of you have been to. I'll just open with a brief description of the discovery of Ajanta. In the early summer of 1819, a British hunting party was heading through thick jungle near Aurangabad when the tiger they were tracking disappeared into a chasm of a deep ravine. Leading the hunters was a Captain John Smith, a young cavalry officer from Madras. And as I only discovered last year from Dieter Schlinghoff, I wasn't going to mention this, but my co-panelists, the great expert on Ajanta, said, are you any relation of Sam Dalrymple, who was one of the other discoverers of Ajanta in the same hunting party? Extraordinary historical quirk. Beckoning his friends to follow, Smith tracked the pug marks down a semicircular scarp of steep basalt and hopped from the rocky bed of the Wagora River. Slides at this point. Working. Can we have the first slide, please? Here we go. Then made his way slowly up the bushes at the far side of a steep horseshoe-shaped amphitheatre of cliffs. Halfway up, Smith stopped dead in his tracks. The pug marks led straight into the opening of a rock face. But the cavity was clearly not a natural cave or a rock-cut grotto. Instead, despite the long grass and the all-encroaching creepers, pepper vines and thick thorny undergrowth, Smith could quite clearly see that he was looking onto a man-made facade cut straight into the rock face. The jagged slope had been painstakingly etched away into a perfect portico. It was clearly a work of great sophistication. Clearly also, it had been abandoned for centuries. A few minutes later, the party made their way gingerly inside, and Smith held aloft a torch of burning dried grass, and his companions clutched their muskets. A long apsidal hall, 100 feet long by 40 feet wide, led straight into the living rock, flanked on either side by 39 octagonal pillars. At the end rose the circular dome of a perfect Buddhist stupa, carved, like everything else, out of the slope of the mountain. All over the walls, the officers could see through the gloom the shadowy outlines of ancient murals. On the pillars were figures of orange and yellow-robed monks with green halos standing on blue lotuses, while on the rock face, Facing on either side of the aisles were long panels of painting filled with elaborate crowd scenes, rather as if a painted scroll had been rolled out along the wall of the apse. In the light of the flickering frames, the officers could see what they later described as figures with curled wigs, crunching over a human skeleton and other debris in the cave, left by generations of predators and scavengers. The party advanced step by step until they reached a pillar at the far end of the hall next to the stupa. There, Smith got out his hunting knife and inscribed on the body of a bodhisattva the words, John Smith, 28th Cavalry, 28th of April, 1819. And I apologize on behalf of my nation for that terrible act of vandalism. In the decades to come, first other hunting parties, then later groups of Orientalists, archaeologists, and Indologists followed Smith's footsteps through the jungle of the Western Ghats to Ajanta, as word spread that in this most remote spot lay 31 caves, which collectively amounted to one of the great wonders of the ancient world. They told the Jataka stories of the lives of the Buddha in images of such extraordinary elegance and grace that they clearly represented a fragment of a lost golden age of Indian painting. They were utterly lovely, but almost alone. With very few exceptions, there's now almost nothing else surviving from the ancient past to compare it with in India, certainly. Very soon, the murals were recognized as some of the greatest masterpieces of art produced by mankind in any century, as well as the finest picture gallery to survive anywhere from ancient civilization. Even today, the pillars glow with a brilliant intensity: topaz dark, lizard green, lotus blue. Get some more images up. This is the famous bodhisattva, or one of the two famous bodhisattvas. There are images of court scenes and images of these extraordinary bodhisattvas dominating everything. These figures of otherworldly beauty, elegance, and compassion, eyes half closed, inward looking, weightlessly swaying on the threshold of enlightenment, caught in what the great historian of Indian art, Stella Cramrish, described wonderfully as a gale of stillness. Now, so extraordinary were these images, and Pia's going to talk more about them, that for years, the slightly less spectacular images in cave, this is cave 1, in cave 10, there were a much earlier set. And I'm just, before handing on to much greater scholars than myself to talk about these things, I'd just like to mention the extraordinary restoration of the paintings of cave 9 and 10, recently completed by Manager Singh of the ASI. These early images turn out to be 700 or 800 years older than the images of Cave 1. Cave 1 is about 600 or 650 CE. The images in Cave 9 and 10 are 150 or 100 BCE. In other words, the same sort of distance that separates us from the tombs in the Lodi Gardens. And these images were initially restored by Italian restorers at the time of the Nizam, then covered in shellac, and the shellac varnish attracted bat muck, which then clung to the images and covered them again. And so, partly eclipsed by the beauty of these extraordinary images in Cave 1, but partly also just by sheer obscurity of the darkness which had enveloped them, they were ignored in many descriptions of Ajanta. And I'm just going to run through a series of slides showing you these extraordinary early images from some of the earliest periods of Indian painting of 150. Yes, please, if you would. The images that Manager Singh restored in Cave 10 have been shown to contain a supreme treasure that had not been previously identified elsewhere. Fragments of the oldest surviving painting of the life of the Buddha. One particularly well-preserved scene showed a group of kings and deities. If you just go back to that previous image, is one of the kings and deities venerating the Bodhi tree and the stupa. These appear to be images of the very first sermon at Sarnath, with a tree taking the place of Gautama Buddha. At this early period, of course, it was unacceptable to depict the actual person of the Buddha. Next slide, is the first sermon, is the legend of Udayana, a tale of two rival queens, one virtuous and one evil. This is actually not that, but don't worry. The evil one places a snake in the veena the king liked to play of an evening, and deviously frames her virtuous competitor as a murderer. But when the enraged king tries to shoot her with an arrow, such is the power of her virtue that the arrow reverses and hits the accuser. The most dramatic and best preserved scenes, however, show two Jataka stories which illustrate tales of killing by huntsmen in the jungles of ancient India, of which this is one. At the furthest most end of the apse, the artist drew images from the Shyama Jataka, which tells the tale of Shyama, a virtuous forest dweller who was fatally hit by the poisoned arrow of the king of Varanasi. And you can see him drawing his arrow in the middle here. Next slide, we might get more, and again. So we can get on to the king. These are his bodyguards. Because he was sinless, the blind parents are able, next again, try and get to the king. Yep. Yeah, here he is, with his arrows coming up behind him. Because he was sinless, the blind parents were able to call back to life the boy and became the king's guru. In illustrating these three stories, the early artists of Ajanta, of Cade 9 and 10, open wide a window to an age which otherwise remains very dark and shadowy to us. We see the costumes of this very early period. The king of Varanasi, for example, wears a white cotton tunic of strikingly Central Asian appearance, wrapped around his waist with a cummerbund, while on his head he wears a very Indian turban cloth, round around. There's also something very different in the style of these early faces. Their physiognomy and the world in which they're depicted may be utterly Indian, yet in the artist's long, bold brushstrokes, the depth and modelling, using perspective and three-quarter profiles, and in the play of light and shade across the brown eyes and the cheekbones. The intimacy, classicism, and striking realism, combined with the haunting wistfulness of these faces, is not a million miles away from the sad, distant, melancholy world of the 1st century AD encaustic wax mummy portraits from Al Fayum in Egypt. Closer to home, there's also interesting parallels with some of the finds of extraordinary textiles excavated in the Tarim Basin. Can we go back? That's exactly this. I know that Pia is going to be also comparing to textiles in a second with more of these images. So realistic are the faces of these people depicted, so direct their expressions, that you feel they have to be portraits of real individuals, glowing still with the flame of eternal life. There is none of the idealization or otherworldliness you see in later images of the bodhisattvas. Instead, there is something deeply hypnotic about the soundless stare of these silent, often uncertain faces. Their fleeting expressions are frozen, startled, as if suddenly surprised by the king's decision to loose an arrow, or by the nobility of the great elephant breaking through the trees. The viewer peers at these figures, trying to catch some hint of the upheavals they witnessed and the strange sights they saw in ancient India. But these smooth, clean faces stare us down. Next, if you would add one after. Look at these extraordinary faces. These are possibly the first really detailed painted images of Indian faces that we have. Next. Look at those faces. There's a kind of sadness and distance in them. There's a wistfulness. Next. That's my favorite, I think, of them all. But perhaps the most disconcerting thing about the people in these murals is that they appear so astonishingly familiar. 2,000 years after they were painted, these faces convey with penetrating immediacy the character of the different sitters. The alert guard, the king caught in the excitement of the hunt, the obedient son fetching water. Indeed, so contemporary are the features, so immediately recognizable are the emotions that play on their lips, that you have to keep reminding yourself that these sitters are not from our world, that they are pigments attached to the walls of a cave, and depict a court in a jungle world of hunters and hunted, of Buddhist monks and devotees that vanished from these now bare Deccan hills 2 millennia ago. Yet, these are still, self-evidently, the same people who inhabit Western India today. Looking at these images, you cannot help feel that but the great distance of time separating them from us, and yet we find in their eyes an emotional immediacy that is at once comprehensible. Some of them look like the guards who admit you this day to the caves. Indeed, while the glass coverings were being removed to allow these photographs to be taken, the guards joked among themselves about which painted king looked like which guard. The women on the cave walls wear the same bangles as the Banjara tribes of these hills still stack on their forearms, and their dupattas are decorated with fringes of tarkam or paitani, still popular in Maharashtra today, as are the fish-scale kham textiles which clothe the hunters on the Shyam Jataka. Pia, over to you.
I don't know. Oh, you can hear me. So I'm going to pick up from what you said about the bare Deccan hill and the painters. And I'm going to look at briefly at the resources and what made these incredible works possible. We think that these caves are now in the middle of nowhere, hard to reach. And in fact, I'm going to be talking about the caves at Aurangabad, which are often confused with the ones at Ajanta and Ellora. Everybody travels to Aurangabad, but they kind of bypass the caves at Aurangabad itself. So I encourage you all to go beyond the Bibi Ka Maqbara on the hill. There's this incredible 10 caves with sculpture that is outstanding. They were once painted like the Ajanta caves. Nothing survives now in terms of painting, but the sculpture is amazing, and you'll see that. But the oldest cave at the site is cave 4, and you can see that the caves are part of the same Ajanta range, the same sort of mountainous hill where Ajanta is. And we think about this area as sort of bare and distant, but in antiquity, these caves and the Buddhist monastic order that was living in these caves were supported by a thriving, actually, economic system that actually places these sites at the convergence of trade and agriculture. We're looking at one of the areas that was one of the most sort of fertile area for the production of cotton. And in antiquity, cotton moved the world. I think we can even talk about a cotton road. You know, we all hear about the Silk Road and Buddhism and all of that. And I think cotton and the trade and the production of cotton was an incredible push for the establishment of Buddhism in this region. And this is not just my fantasy, I hope, but I'm trying to show that, for instance, cotton textiles are represented in the paintings at Ajanta, in the Ajanta Cave 10. I would like to point to your attention the decoration of the garment of the figure represented there. It's exactly the same resist dye pattern that you see on a fragment of Indian cotton excavated in an archaeological context from the Roman port of Berenike on the Red Sea in Egypt. So Indian cotton from the Deccan went quite far, and these caves were situated in an ideal position to exploit natural resources and international trade. We know about international trade from this important text written in Alexandria that talks about textile trade, and this trade, I think, continued until the 5th century. We have at Ajanta, down the cave, findings of gold coins, actually one in particular, that comes from the eastern fringes of the Roman Empire from the 5th century. So we know that these caves are situated in an ideal kind of international setting. So who paid for these caves and why? I think the local rulers were the patrons and supported the excavations on the caves and the Sangha who lived it. It's important not only to give the Sangha a home, but you need to support it. And so I think these patrons invested in their own salvation by supporting the Sangha and establishing the caves. In Cave 3 at Aurangabad, we have actually, I believe, an incredible representation of who the patrons of the caves were. They are life-size sculptures carved inside the shrine. So if you go to Cave 3 at Aurangabad, just kneel down right next to this sculpture. They're life-size, and you'll be essentially worshipping the Buddha with them. There are two groups of devotees, likely the royal princely patron of the cave. The cave was once painted, but we get a glimpse of the incredible talent of the sculptors of the 5th century. The devotees, devotion is what kept these sites alive, and devotion continued through the centuries. So around the 6th century, when Ajanta sort of patronage starts to kind of slow down and fade away, Aurangabad continues to go strong. New caves are carved, and in cave 2, we don't find anymore the royal patrons, but we find panels attached, carved onto the wall surfaces with small devotees, you can see where the arrow is, just kneeling down again at the feet of this vision of the Buddha that sort of emerges from a lotus flower. And these panels are from individual donors. Everyone would donate a panel, and you can see the hooks where the garlands, there would be nails and garlands would be hanging. So you get the sense for what worship practices were. And just to be quick and to give the voice to my co-speakers, one last thing I'd like to show you, and that's really an incredible sculpture in Cave 7 that continues to show how Aurangabad was sort of situated in an area that had far-reaching connections with the Indian Ocean and beyond. And by the 6th century, Buddhist devotees worshipped bodhisattvas or future Buddhas that would protect them in their travels and in their endeavors. And so on your actually left side, you have this bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, who protects travelers. And one of the big things he does, he protects travelers who travel on the ocean. You can see this shipwreck with a ship with 2 masts, that is a transoceanic ship, and someone with a pointed cap on it, clearly a foreigner, someone who probably a trader who would engage in trade with India. So even we are in the middle of the Deccan Plateau, we are looking at an international far-reaching system, and Buddhism is situated right at the convergence of this sort of incredible development of trade and, of course, local agriculture. And perhaps with this I should end, otherwise I would not sort of give voice to the other speaker, but just one last thing to point out is that these connections between the world of the Silk Road and the Cotton Road exist. The bodhisattva who saves devotees from dangers is not very common as an iconography in India, but you find it a lot in the caves of Central Asia, in the so-called Silk Road caves. So it's something that ties the two worlds together. And another important presence that connects the Cotton Road with the Silk Road is the diffusion of the iconography of the Buddha in Parinirvana, the dying Buddha. It's not a common icon in the Indian world. You find it in the Deccan, you find it in the Northwest, and you find it a lot in Central Asia along the Silk Road caves, and it appears here at Aurangabad. So we're looking at a connected world, deeply so, and there's so much more to say, but I have to stop, and I'm very happy to hand the microphone to my colleague. Thank you.
It's wonderful to be on such a distinguished panel, and the caves I'm going to talk about, though, have very little to do with what Pia and William have talked about. So usually when you think of historical India through the lens of archaeology, it is cities and villages, it is cities in states and empires that swim into view. Forests barely or rarely figure, except when the arable is pushing back the forests, or when there are trade routes that cut across forests, those are being delineated. So forests are seen as something that must yield to civilization, or as spaces that you go through which connect pockets of civilization. What I'm going to try and show you is, on the other hand, that actually forests with historical markers like caves are very much a part of historical India. And in fact, urban folk did not just live in cities, they also created caves and inhabited them. And I'm going to do that through the example of Bandhavgarh. The hill of Bandhavgarh, you can see here with its extraordinary tableland, and you have one of the caves which you can see is being overtaken by the forests. Presently, the Bandhavgarh caves are inhabited by tigers, and it's wonderful to see how caves get repurposed. But originally, these caves were made in the 2nd century CE for human habitation. There are lots of caves here, along with my students, Devdatta Sanyal and Shomoita Banerjee, and a local, very renowned naturalist called Satyendra Tiwari. For the last 2 years during COVID, I've actually been trying to track caves. We've documented about 81 of them, and I'm sure there are many more. Oops, yeah. So the caves are of various types. The one that you see, on the top left is a small cave in Jamunia, which covers less than 1 square meters. And at the bottom, you can see another cave called Badi Gufa, quite appropriately, because it is 250 times the size of the Jamunia cave. There are also many unique cave shelters. One of them you see on the top right, where there is a little pool, in the middle of a corridor, and the corridor itself is surrounded by rooms. And this is called Rani Ki Jhiriya, locally, with the idea that, well, the Rani used to actually inhabit these. And as you can see, the caves flourished in the forests. And, these were very integral. The forest was very integral to those who used these caves. Bandhavgarh, as many of you who would have visited it would know, is a very large hill. But when you actually put all the caves on the map, it's very clear that they're all located on the northern slope and towards the north of, the hill. Now, there are many reasons for this. The south, for example, has a very low shade cover. And that's why the caves there, if they were made, would have been oppressively hot, except in the cold season. The hill also slopes from the south to the north. So, there's much more water there in all seasons. And in fact, the soft sandstone in the hot season releases all the underground water. Then if you look at the inscriptions, a lot of people who came to Bandhavgarh in ancient times arrived from the north. So you have cities in the inscriptions like Kaushambi and Mathura that are mentioned. And surely it is the north face they would have encountered first. And finally, of course, the most accessible way to reach the tableland is, from the northern slopes. That is where you have the two routes. So there are all kinds of reasons for this. And I imagine ancient inhabitants, like many of us today, would have marveled at the wonderful vistas of the meadows and the forests that you can see from the top of the Bandhavgarh plateau. And, the view is different from every side. In many ways, the caves have architectural features that actually help us in understanding how the forest, that is the exterior, was very much a part of the interior. So there are some caves which are long halls, but they have small rooms attached to them, which have skylights. Of course, the rain would have come in, and this was done to facilitate the circulation of air. But surely small animals and birds would also have found their way in. And, it was such unwanted guests, which I think ensured that after a point, you didn't have caves being made, apart from the early ones with, these partially open rooftops. You also have caves like this. This is cave 39, and you can see that there are niches on the sides of the pillars, on the long sides, where actually bamboo and sticks were put. And this must have been done to keep the animals out. If you look at what you find inside these caves today, you know, there are the pug marks of tigers. You also have the droppings of mongoose, the high-pitched sounds of bats flying around. And surely, you know, this is not the kind of creature companionship that ancient travelers here wanted. So they devised a way in which, you know, the usual inhabitants of the forest were actually kept out. The caves, unlike the ones that Pia and William have talked about, are not primarily religious. But there are some caves which do carry occasional markings. So this is a cave in the Amaiko area, and you can see that there is a Jain, what looks like a Jain Tirthankar that has been carved on one of the pillars, but it's just one, you know, carving that you find in the cave. So you can't actually think of these as having been made for religious communities. I imagine if there were caves for the Buddhists, you would have stupas, you would have at least some carvings and inscriptions which would, you know, have a distinctly Buddhist flavor, but you don't find that. You also have cave 4, which has an extraordinary visual scheme that combines something religious with the nature of the forest and a hunt. So this, you know, the cave is extraordinary because it has this long inscription which mentions merchants and, you know, traders, but it also has shallow carvings like this. And you can see here the tiger, you can see monkeys, you can see fish, and right in front, you can see a human being that is clearly Sankarshan Balram, because, you know, he carries a plow in one hand and, you know, what appears to be, you know, a weapon in the other hand. So, you know, this is the nature of many of the caves. I could have talked about this more, but I think I want to just talk about the inscriptions very briefly. Inscriptions like this actually tell us about the patronage for these caves. This is the Brahmi script. Most of the inscriptions are in Prakrit, and there are about 2 or 3 inscriptions in Sanskrit, those that were actually put down by a couple of king donors. Now, most of the donors here are merchants, Vanajikas and Nigamas, and my most favorite is a character called Pussa, who just did not donate a cave and create you know, a reservoir there, but he also created in the rocky hill a Vyayam Shala. That is what is mentioned. You know, a gymnasium in ancient times in the caves is actually quite rare. And you can imagine, you know, what travelers who took a break at Bandhavgarh did sometimes before they went on with their journeys. But there are other donors. There are craftspeople.
Can I ask what the gymnasium, what would have gone on in the gymnasium? What?
They would have done some exercise, some kushti. Yeah, it's a Vyayam Shala, that's what it's called. It's just a long covered porch, you know, which is not covered in front. But the epigraph clearly identifies it as a Vyayam Shala. Apart from craftspeople, you have ministers making very elaborate donations, and you also occasionally have king donors. But the question that I ask myself is, what about the people who actually made this, you know, this body of caves, who did all the hard work of the chiseling and so on? They remain anonymous. And we know that the caves were created from the front to the back. But who these people were, there are only occasional rare hints in the caves. So there is one trader who mentions that the merit he is going to earn by digging a well, half the merit of the well, would go to those who actually did the digging. So, that's how sometimes you get a sense of, those who actually did all the hard work here. I want to end with cave 1. The first cave right at the crossroads in the midst of the meadows at the edge of the Chakradhara. And, I want to mention it because it gives you a sense of the history of wildlife. So when I first saw this cave, so there were all these inscriptions, lots of inscriptions, but also faint lines which suggested animals. Now, when I sent this to one of my collaborators, Sushmita Basu Majumdar of Kolkata University, this is what she found. She found actually that there were multiple elephants that were camouflaging some of the Brahmi inscriptions. Now, if you followed the news in the last 3 years, there's actually been, there have been herds of wild elephants that have come into Bandhavgarh. And there's a lot of talk about the return of the elephants after more than a century. But if you were to ask the historical question, which is that how far back can you push the presence of elephants on the basis of evidence in Bandhavgarh, I would say that it definitely goes back to the 2nd century CE. So the caves are not just places created by, all kinds of donors, dark, rocky resting places in the midst of trees and leaf-sodden spaces, but they also have these, clues which help in giving us some sense of the ecology in ancient times. Thank you very much.
All right, so I grew up reading Will's work. I attended a course by Professor Brancaccio a few years ago, and I'm a huge fan of Professor Lahiri's book on Ashoka. So you can imagine just how intimidating it is for me to be going up after all of these people and hoping, first of all, to be part of the same panel as them, and to hope that my presentation will add something to the magnificent scholarship that all of them have done over the years. So what I'm going to be talking about is another cave site in the Deccan, Ellora, which I hope that many of you, if you have not already been, that my presentation will convince you at some point, sooner rather than later, to go to. Now, to begin with, I'd like to ask the question, why Ellora? And we see in Ellora a very similar dynamic to all the other caves we've seen earlier, where it is not just a question of royals who are excavating these caves, but once again, you can't really see it on that map, but you can see that it's clearly part of this very wide-ranging network of trade that is by no means confined to the subcontinent, but really extends far, far beyond. And there's one particular artery that you might notice in the central western part of India, where there's this great corridor that seems to pierce into the peninsular part of the subcontinent that was once known as the Dakshinapatha, or the Southern Way, which incidentally is the origin of the term Deccan that we use today. And Ellora was an important stop on the Dakshinapatha. So as traders, merchants, monks began to move from North India into Southern India, they would stop at Ellora. And you can see in that photograph there, this great waterfall that is still present at Ellora today. That's a photograph I took in 2019, just after the monsoon. And for many, many centuries, even corresponding to the earliest caves in Ellora, it seems that this was considered to be a tirtha, some kind of crossing place that was sacred to many, many religious traditions, where people would come and bathe. It was associated with many ancient myths of the Shaivites especially. But from as early as the 5th century, when we really begin to see Shaivites appearing in Ellora, there's already this sense that they're just one among dozens of other communities there. And we are told that this Shaivite king actually takes a few villages that were already there at Ellora and grants them to Shaivite Brahmins, who then grant it to even more Shaivite Brahmins, and therefore gradually begin to try and appropriate the site into Shaivism. But it is not really a very successful process, because Ellora, much like today, had a large thriving settlement that serviced the caves. And it was not just the Shaivites, but also Buddhists and Jains of various different schools who were commissioning caves. And it wasn't really royals in the early period who were commissioning them, but rather merchants, monks, and people who were living in the nearby city who would commission these caves and then frequently visit them. Now, Ellora, generally, the caves that you will visit when you go there, number around 32, 34, but in reality, Ellora has dozens upon dozens of caves, I think nearly 100, that were excavated century over century. And what is really fascinating about Ellora is that because you have so many religious traditions there, the sculptors who are making these caves happen to work on multiple caves at the same time. So you will see features in the Jain caves that are replicated in the Shaivite caves, in the Buddhist caves, and so on. So it's not really this clear progression from Buddhism to Shaivism to Jainism, but rather many communities that are living that are excavating the caves at the same time and really borrowing religious practices from each other. I'd like to also briefly touch upon the art history of Ellora, because it is, in my view, considering its great antiquity and the many centuries over which excavations happen, it is really one of the great sites of human artistic achievement. If you were to look at the earliest sculptures, for example, as you can see on the left, you have these very stiff, roughly human-sized sculptures, that primarily tend to be these standing deities. But you will begin to see by the 6th and 7th centuries that the understanding of the local sculptors of how to depict human bodies becomes far more sophisticated. And it's certain that this happened partially due to their interactions with the caves of Ajanta as well. We have to remember that while many of the sites that we're talking about today are these few sites that happen to survive and that have been excavated from ancient India, that two people who are living at Ellora, they were just one part of this vast landscape of different caves and different trade networks. And all of these artistic sites, all these economic sites are very much in conversation with each other. And I particularly like this magnificent sculpture of the Saptamatrikas, the seven mothers, because there's this feeling that all these sculptures are brimming with this kind of calm energy. And there's this extraordinary naturalism to the hairstyles of some of these women. And you will actually see that they're quite similar to the hairstyles of Bollywood actresses in the 60s and 70s, because there was actually this deliberate move in independent India to go back to what we thought of as classical art at the time and try to incorporate that into the way that we dressed and presented ourselves. Roughly around the late 8th century, something quite remarkable happens, which is that we have the first datable royal inscription at Ellora. This ambitious young king known as Dantidurga from the Rashtrakuta family, which actually originates from an area about a few hundred kilometers northwest of Ellora, is drawn to the site because it is such an important center for all these religious communities, and he has this understanding that commissioning a cave here would be a great way to advertise his military prowess over the rest of the subcontinent. He is at war with his former overlords, the Chalukya dynasty, based in northern Karnataka, and what he does at Ellora is he actually bathes in the waters of the Tirtha. And you can actually stand this close to the Tirtha, which is actually where I took that photograph, and you can actually very much imagine this young king actually bathing in the waters and believing that he imbibed through that bathing some of the powers that flowed in the waters. And Dantidurga, of course, commissions this extraordinary temple, Cave 15, also known today as the Dashavatara Cave. And it is called the Dashavatara because it has many depictions of Vishnu in various forms, even though it's actually a Shaivite cave. And like so many other Shaivite sites in the early medieval period, this was actually originally a Buddhist stupa a Buddhist monastery that the Shaivites then come in and appropriate. And I find it really remarkable because you can see, especially if you compare it to Bandhavgarh or to Ajanta and Aurangabad, that it's very much part of the same kind of artistic tradition of building these cave temples, but there's this remarkable understanding really of light and dark and shadow. And there's this very complex arrangement of the pillars, which you can't actually see all of them in this photograph. But the great American sculptor actually describes this as almost being like Indra's gem. As you stand in one place and look down these lines and lines of pillars, as if your vision refracts, and you see all these different aspects of the Godhead. And that, I think, is really a sign to me, because if you think about the people who are making them, these caves, in the 8th, 9th centuries, they thought of themselves as the apogee, the pinnacle, the result of these many, many centuries of development of cave temples. And they're really remarkably unrestrained in the way that they depict these gods. I think I will.
We're going to do 5 more minutes. We went over time.
Yes, I will trouble you all with a few more minutes of nerding out about Ellora's art history. But you will see here that in comparison to the first couple of images that we saw, these standing stiff sculptures moving on to these calm, peaceful kind of sculptures, that there's something very new happening at the Dashavatara cave, where the sculptors at Ellora seem to have figured out how to incorporate dynamism and energy into their sculptures. So if you were to really try to imagine this mass of rock that depicts the god Narasimha, you can see his lower leg has actually broken off, but when it was originally there, it would have seemed like he was pouncing almost into the conflict with the demon that he's fighting there. And if you were to imagine the way that the sculptor has modeled the body of the god, it's this central lithe column of rock that at its top is expanding into, like unfurling into these many more arms, which gives the impression of this momentum that's unfolding and almost radiating with power. And I will come to another example of that, hopefully, if we have the time. This, of course, is the most extraordinary of all the structures that were ever excavated at Ellora, the great Kailashanatha, or what would potentially have been known as the Krishneshwara temple, now known as Cave 16. And you can see that it is technically a cave temple. It is technically a cave, but it's actually this enormous excavation straight into the cliff face. And if you were to compare it in scale to what was being done at Ajanta and Bandhavgarh and Aurangabad, you will see just how extraordinary the ambition of these cave temple excavators had become by this point of time. If you were to actually, it's a single monolithic sculpture that is so large that it is really architecture at this point. The understanding that these individuals have of space and light by this point in time is just extraordinary. You can see that they seem to have understood that if they just excavated this massive trench into the rock and made the temple only have a single story, it would have been quite dark at the bottom. So what they do is actually create it as a 2-storied structure. And in order to increase the feeling of space that you have at the bottom, they carve this additional gallery into the bottom half. And just the scale of this thing is absolutely titanic. I'm hoping that we just have a little bit of time to discuss this extraordinary sculpture of Shiva as the slayer of the elephant demon. And if you go back to what I was saying about the understanding of dynamism and energy, if you were to look at the sculpture of Narasimha now that we just looked at a little earlier, that's about the size of a human being, right? This is about twice the size of a man. It's a titanic mass of rock. And somehow the artists really have figured out how to give this a sense of dynamism. Now, it is not easy to give such a massive chunk of rock a feeling of movement. But once again, to go back to the sculptor Kamal Bergson, she wrote something in her book on Ellora that has stayed with me ever since, which is that the sculptor, or more realistically, based on discussion that Professor Brancaccio and I are having, was...
We've got 2 more minutes.
Just another minute.
Director's privilege.
This is why I'm very glad to do sessions with Will, because I get to do this. But very clearly, the sculptor seems to have enjoyed the challenge of imparting dynamism to this. And let me just explain to you how we can get a sense of that. So this is a very rough illustration that I've done. The gentleman that you see on the right is just to give you a sense of the scale. And this is really what people at this point of time looked like. So rather different, as you can see, in terms of their hairstyle and so on from the people of Ellora. But if you were to just pare down, just ignore all the sculptural ornamentation, really pare it down to the basics, you will see that fundamentally it's this great funnel of rock that has been twisted by excavating this deep cavity towards its center to give the sense that it is rotating around itself, right? So you already have a sense that this huge mass is moving. But the issue with this is that all these arms seem to dissipate the momentum of this rotation. And the way that the sculptor solved this problem is to use the skin of the elephant to contain that entire mass of rock. And so instead, what you get a sense of is not just this central funnel of rock that is moving, but in fact, this enormous mass of the elephant and of all the arms. And then, just to cap off this extraordinary compositional achievement, you see all those arms, right? That are rotating all around him, and yet the very last arm on the right is caressing the cheek of Uma. And so all this momentum is being contained and stilled by this single hand, expressing Shiva's love for his wife.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
I don't think there'll be time for questions, I'm afraid.
Nayanjot Lahiri, Anirudh Kanisetti, and William Dalrymple for such an incredible, informative section. I know he has a lot to talk, and maybe two of you also have a lot to tell us, but I think over another session, another time. Thank you so very much for being here. Thank you. Ji.
We're all going to sign books. We're all signing books.
There